All right. Well, as we get our last few participants to join us, Josh Busby, an associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. I have the honor of introducing our speaker for today, but before I do that, I wanted to talk about the wider UT Energy Symposium calendar. So obviously we're going to be talking about China's decarbonization challenge today, but we have a talk on energy and economic growth from Tiago Domingos from the University of Lisbon next week. And then we'll have spring break. So there won't be a speaker during that week. And then after spring break on March 23rd, we'll be joined by Michael Young in the Bureau of Economic Geology to talk about the land energy nexus in Texas. Thank you all for joining us today to hear from Michael Davidson, an assistant professor at the University of California in San Diego. He's going to be talking about China's decarbonization challenge. And as we know, China is now risen to be the leading contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions, upwards on 27% of the global total. And so very important. They've made some recent overtures to announce a 2060 decarbonization net zero target that Dr. Davidson will talk about. So rather than steal his thunder, I want to introduce him. He's an assistant professor at the School of Global Policy and Strategy and the Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering Department of the Jacobs School of Engineering. He was previously at the US-China Climate Policy Coordinator for the environmental nonprofit Natural Resources Defense Council, and he received his Ph.D. from MIT. So we are delighted to have him. He has his Ph.D. in engineering systems. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Michael.
Thanks, Josh. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to be talking about China's decarbonization challenge today, as Josh indicated. Throw up some slides here in a second. But yeah, lots of new activity recently. Let's see here. Right. So lots of exciting activity here to talk about. And hopefully engage you all in this discussion. So first off, I wanted to just tell you a little bit about my research agenda. So I'm really thinking about managing low carbon transitions, first thinking around the low carbon infrastructure planning, as well as institutions and particularly energy institutions, and how do we change some of the incumbency and understand the political dynamics. And I do this through thinking and using engineering economic models that combine power systems operations as well as renewable resource assessments. And then also thinking about a very important subtext, either explicit or implicit, which is the political economy drivers of how do you reshape these energy institutions, which in most places were developed around fossil and conventional resources, and thinking about whether or not you need to pursue very expansive market transformations or what other types of state planning approaches might work. And a big part of that is what do you do with all this existing fossil infrastructure that's out there. So the outline for my talk today, I'm going to first frame the challenge. It's actually many challenges, but we'll just call it the challenge, which is really how does China steer this very carbon intensive economy towards carbon neutrality? And I'm going to have to spend a lot of time focusing on the grid, since we know that two big parts of decarbonizing economy are, one, electrifying significant parts of direct fossil fuel use, and then cleaning up the grid so that electricity doesn't emit carbon emissions. And then I'm going to chat briefly at the end about some additional signs and policies that China is putting in place to push the frontier on low carbon technology. So first off, the challenge. So we know China has made a number of climate targets recently. As part of the Paris Agreement, China put forward a goal by 2030 to peak carbon emissions. They also recently expanded their goal to achieve 25% of primary energy from non-fossil sources, and also made it made a commitment to install 1,200 gigawatts of wind and solar. Currently, they're about 500 gigawatts, so this would require 700 more gigawatts of wind and solar, so roughly 70 gigawatts combined per year. This is very doable. There's more likely the 25% target's going to be a little bit harder to achieve and would potentially entail more like 100 gigawatts a year. Additionally, China has made 2035 as a pretty important political milestone for achieving what Xi Jinping has called socialist modernization. And we should expect that there's going to be a number of renewable energy or climate targets associated and plans associated with that. And then finally, the big target, China committed to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. This is about 10 years later than what the EU had committed to do. And there's some discussion right now in China as to whether they could push that forward a little bit. But nonetheless, this is a pretty big pivotal milestone in China's climate target governance. And then finally, what we're all waiting for this week, starting in Beijing, is the 2-meeting session where they're going to discuss and approve the 14th Five-Year Plan, which is going to lay out a set of targets for the broader economy, but we'd expect some energy-specific targets going through 2025 to most likely have them move along the goal towards the 2030 Paris targets. So the big question here today is, how does China steer a very heavily coal-dominant system? So this is capacity. China changes so fast that this data is already a little bit out of date. With over 1,000 gigawatts of coal generation, similarly very coal dependent, and a very industry heavy system. So this is a breakdown of industry services, residential electricity consumption. Just by comparison, here's the US. So we have a very, very difficult and huge transformation required in both the energy system and the demand side to achieve broader decarbonization. And just one set of modeling studies that have been done out there, this is led by a team at Tsinghua University, shows how the electricity sector might evolve in a 2 degrees C pathway scenario. So you can see that under this scenario, China is going to have to reduce emissions substantially from, these are gigatons of CO2, reduce emissions substantially across the entire economy, and particular shifting a number of electricity industry and transport to electricity uses, and then cleaning up the grid. There's also a little bit of room for sinks and CCS. And just as a snapshot to give you a sense of what the numbers mean here, in this scenario for 2050 capacity, here what we're talking about. We're talking about in 2050, China having cumulative installed roughly 2 terawatts each of wind and solar, nuclear over 300 gigawatts. These wind and solar targets would roughly imply that China should be building 70 gigawatts a year of each wind and solar for the next 30 years. And nuclear similarly would require massive deployment, increased scale up from what its historical trends were. And if you just look at it, 1.5 degree pathway, then the challenge is even more great. And so the question is, what is it going to take to achieve these? And I'm going to be talking about technologies to achieve these, as well as institutions. Both are very critical and are huge problems currently in improving the efficiency and environmental performance of China's grid. So let's jump right into it. So China's electricity sector began, as most other places, with a vertically integrated state utility. As many other countries faced, developing countries faced in the 80s and 90s, their state finances were limited. This prompted a reform to allow more investment into the sector. There were issues that arose when you had these other kinds of investments, other owners, IPPs competing with the state-run utilities and some unfair competition. So there was another series of reforms to corporatize and unbundle the generation grid companies. And this led to a fairly long period of relative stasis, but that a number of challenges arose in the Chinese grid. In particular, What I'm going to be talking about today is the inefficient dispatch problems, overcapacity, particularly in coal and renewable energy curtailment. And these issues, after accumulating for over a decade, gave rise to the latest round of electricity sector reforms inaugurated in 2015, which had a big focus on markets. And the challenge here for why markets are so important is that we see some very strange and inefficient investments in operation occurring in the Chinese power sector. So these are new capacity builds of thermal over the last 2 decades. And then on the right side, I'm plotting capacity factors of the thermal plants. So first off, you can see most of China's thermal power sector is less than 20 years old. You had a very large boom in the early 2000s, sustaining through the next decade, mostly in response to China's joining the WTO, a lot more export-intensive industries, and a lot of domestic infrastructure. So huge boom in coal deployment. Then, as the demand started to taper off, coal deployment really didn't slow down too much, and in fact, it accelerated at various points in the subsequent decades. And so, as a result of that, coal capacity factors have been declining, and now they're basically hovering below 50%. These reflect a very deep-seated challenge between the central government's desire to achieve some efficiency and self-sufficiency in power sector, but also local government needs to drive a lot of investment in the sector. Now we have renewable energy coming into the picture around the late 2000s, first with wind and later with solar. Just a few years after beginning to seriously install wind, China started to face some pretty serious curtailment issues. And so curtailment occurs when you have a free resource like the wind or the sun, and you're not taking it up to its full availability for a variety of grid reasons. We usually think of these as mostly technical reasons, but in fact, you can have a lot of other institutional market reasons why you might curtail. So China was seeing very large curtailment rates early on. They started to fall in 2014, and you can find some stories from back then claiming that renewable energy integration problem was solved. But then just the next year, curtailment started to go back up. And in 2016, just to give you a sense of what the impact of this curtailment of, it's roughly 40 megatons of CO2 if you assume that all of that curtailment had to have been met by a marginal coal unit. These are very small penetrations of wind. So as we scale up to much larger wind and solar penetrations as called for in China's climate targets, we would expect to see the curtailment problem having a much bigger carbon impact. Around that time, solar started to come in as well. And then after 2016, we start to see some declines in wind and solar curtailment, as at the same time that we see massive new increases in solar and wind capacity. And then last year, the current numbers are 121 gigawatts installed per year. In that year. That has, there's some questions around whether the extent to which that wind capacity was actually installed in 2020 or just connected and installed the previous year, or maybe built and maybe not connected. But so there's a little bit of uncertainty there, but you can see that China's already hitting that 100 gigawatt mark per year of solar and wind, while also managing pretty low levels of curtailment. So the question here is why? One big cause is demand growth. So you'll see here, demand growth basically plummeted in 2015, around the same time that curtailment rates started to have a resurgence. And you can imagine that if the pie is bigger, it's easier to integrate more of that renewable energy. And you saw some pretty sustained demand growth over the subsequent years as curtailment rates have been falling. Now, demand has been falling because it can't maintain the previous. So in the early 2000, you're looking at 10% plus demand growth. We don't expect that to occur in China going forward. So there's a big question as they're trying to ramp up more wind and solar at the same time demand growth is falling, that maybe we might see some additional issues with curtailment again. If we look at this regionally, These are a plot of some of the major wind provinces in China and plotting the curtailment percentage and then the share of local provincial production in the power system. You'll see that some provinces actually reached over 40% curtailment. So that's 40% of the wind energy wasted before it could get onto the grid. Some declines, as we saw around in the latest years, 2019, but still some significant problems that we emerge here. And we can look at this by comparison with ERCOT. So ERCOT also saw some really high levels of curtailment in the late 2000s. And there's a couple of measures in ERCOT that help to resolve the issues with curtailment. One is that a nodal spot market was put in place. This generates more granular geographic price signals that would provide better incentives for where to site and also for flexibility and balancing. And then a set of multi-year transmission upgrades were completed. And that after that, ERCOT wind curtailment levels are at pretty manageable levels, though slightly increasing over time. But there's a big question as to whether these two sets of institutions, these two sets of policies and technologies, infrastructures could solve Chinese wind curtailment problems. Particularly, all these provinces are going to be different. And we have also additional layers of the market problems that I've been alluding to. And so one way of determining what are the causes of curtailments is through operational optimization problems. And so for those of folks who are familiar with these things, I'm just taking a unit commitment economic dispatch optimization where I'm minimizing short-run production costs subject to a variety of technical constraints. And then I'm also adding in some of the constraints that we know China's power system dispatch operators face on a daily and monthly basis. Some of those scheduling institutions that exist in China are quotas. So coal generators are given on an annual basis a minimum amount of quota or a plan that they're allowed to generate throughout the year, regardless of their efficiency. You have planned transfers between provinces. There are not really any significant interprovincial market mechanisms at the moment that operate on fine timescales. They usually operate over fairly long timescales. There's also not very much sharing of reserves between provinces. So if you think about provinces having to maintain a lot of additional generating capacity online in case you have some outages or contingencies. And then finally, China's power system operators in most provinces and regions still have a fairly long horizon when they're deciding whether or not to turn on conventional coal units. So you're thinking about making commitment decision a week or in a month in advance, which makes it very difficult to incorporate uncertainties associated with renewable energy. This may work if you have a relatively predictable high industrial load for the whole month, but when you start to get more unpredictable supply and more unpredictable demand, then this can become challenging. So just one example of the type of modeling that's done that we could use to investigate this curtailment problem. So this is a week in Inner Mongolia. The gray bars here when we're seeing curtailment come out of the model. So this is wasted wind that is not able to be accepted onto the grid. If we plot this against the other generators on the system, we see some of the causes arise. So first off, China has a large amount of cogeneration units in the north where a lot of the wind is co-located. This means that those units which must run because they have to provide heat to the residents have relatively higher minimum loads. That means that the wind needs to be curtailed during those time periods because of the lack of flexibility. Another key consideration comes in with these commitment constraints. So once you commit these coal units, they have a minimum load, and curtailment tends to occur when you're at their minimum loads as well. The more interesting thing comes in when you look at the institutional effects. And so these are looking at different assumptions around when the commitment decision was made, what was the forecast that system operators had for wind. So if you make it a month in advance, you really don't have a lot of information about what the forecast is going to be. You might assume that they have some kind of low level of wind based on historic levels, or they might, as is the case in many of the dispatch operators that I spoke with, they might just assume that wind doesn't contribute anything to meeting those demand. And those have big effects on the overall curtailment rates as well as production costs in the system. And so if you imagine you start with the most constrained system up here in the Northeast, as you fix various components of the system, you can both reduce curtailment and reduce production costs. In particular, we find that fixing the scheduling and improving forecast has the biggest impact on both costs and curtailment rates. By contrast, if you just regionalize the dispatch and even eliminated the quota, you could see some marginal gains in the curtailment rates. You could see some improvements in production costs as you get rid of the quota because you're shifting from low efficiency to high efficiency generators. Nevertheless, the big challenge that China is going to be facing going forward with having higher penetrations of wind and solar is to really fix the scheduling system such that they can incorporate these forecasts better and better forecast information. And this is really an age-old challenge of operations and investment. So how do you have efficient operations, and how do you also have efficient investment and recoup your investment into the system? This is with a little bit of a China flavor. So China has been, on the operations side, adopting more market-based mechanisms as well as some mandates to improve efficiency in the short run. And on the investment side, pursuing what seems to be a somewhat paradoxical or contradictory approach, which is expanding government planning over investment, sector planning, capital allocation, particularly through state-owned enterprises. This is a challenge that has bedeviled a lot of power systems as they grapple with how do you maintain short-run production efficiency while also ensuring that you have sufficient investment going into the system. If we look at what China's been doing on the operations side, the lines in blue here represent the planned version. So what happened in China prior to 2015 in most provinces was that the governments at the central and local level would set quotas and set prices, and it was all relatively rigid. It was quite difficult for a private investor to come in and be assured that they could make back significant amounts of money or be incentivized to appropriately locate their facility. There was somewhat of a guarantee for the large incumbent firms that when they build something, they're going to be able to generate a certain amount to achieve their quota. The markets are changing those things, and actually the markets are quite substantial, even after just a few years. The key mechanisms by which the markets are changing these things are by going around this government-led quota and price setting process to allow particular large generators and large industry to contract together or to go through exchanges put together in all of the provinces and regions. And if we take a look at what the marketization rates are in China, some of them are quite substantial. We see in some places shares of electricity being sold through markets as opposed to through the plan or the quota reaching 50%. And if we look forward, what are some possible power market construction processes? This is one potential staging of how markets could be created in China. The first is you can begin with physical forward markets. This is a pretty common pitfall in China and a lot of other countries' approach to developing markets. And it generally restricts your system's ability to manage short-term operations and makes it very difficult to form very efficient short-run production decisions. But nevertheless, all provinces in China have started with physical forward contracts before they have, in some cases, moved on to other shorter term markets or still just sticking with the physical forward markets for the time being. You have a couple of interesting markets in China. I say interesting with a little bit of an asterisk. They're very unique China-specific markets that generate some very strange price behavior. I mean, you can understand the rationale behind it, but they also are not going to be the most efficient way of dealing with, for example, the wind curtailment problem. And then you have a handful of pilots in spot markets that have a mixture of financial and physical forward contracts but with also a lot of rules on the spot markets and generating, in some cases, some very strange outcomes. So just for those that are kind of familiar with the Chinese geography, here are some of the provinces that have been designated for spot market pilots. And all of these have entered some form of trial operation. Guangdong is the furthest along, but even in Guangdong, which is known for being somewhat of a leader in developing market mechanisms, incorporating different kind of competition into their economy, has a big problem with operating the system and generating real fundamentals in their spot market. In addition, layered on top of this, you have all these other ancillary service markets, in particular this kind of Chinese-specific peak regulation market that I mentioned. And there's going to be a big tension going forward between these two types of markets, because the peak regulation and the spot markets really solve this problem in two very different ways, and they're not really compatible. So there's going to be a big challenge as the scale of these provincial spot market pilots expand. How do you rectify these kind of inherent tensions between different approaches to solving these issues? Something that comes up a lot, not just in electricity markets, but across the board when you're thinking about economic planning in China, is tensions between the central and the local government. And the current market approach in electricity sectors is largely center initiated. So we had the 2015 number 9 document that set forward electricity market plans in the sector, but it's been province led. And when the provinces are leading it, you tend to get relatively divergent designs that are based on local conditions, and provincial governments are using these as another lever in their toolbox to engage in what they were doing before around sector and economic planning. So they can benefit local interest groups, for example, local industries, maintain or reinforce protectionist barriers to trade. So there's, as I mentioned, there's very little market-based trading between provinces at the moment. This is going to be a huge challenge as China tries to generate more power from renewable energy and take advantage of smoothing over larger geographic areas. And there's also attempts to maintain control over sector operation and scheduling. So that I mentioned the commitment scheduling problem that we see right now around thermal units. Some of the local authorities are going to have to give up a lot of control over their sector in order to gain the efficiencies from the market and deal with this integration challenge. And there's a big tension right now. And as a result, these market differences between provinces are, I think, going to frustrate most attempts to generate any significant national trading power, if until they have somewhat more centralized design of electricity markets. Going back to this planning and operations problem, resource adequacy has now emerged as a pretty key planning uncertainty in China. For those of you who have just lived through the Texas freeze, you know a little bit about resource adequacy right now, even if you didn't beforehand. And the challenge with China is that forecasted demand can vary. It varies based on what are the assumptions on electrification to meet decarbonization goals. It's also varying a lot based on economic activity. We just look at the Tsinghua University study I showed at the beginning around where the ranges just across the scenarios they were looking at. You might be looking at somewhere around 9 to 10 petawatt hours in 2030, and maybe 11 to 14 petawatt hours in 2050. So those imply very different amounts of capacity you need to bring onto the system. And China has already had a number of periods of localized energy shortages that are very salient to politicians right now. So there were some in 2004, in 2011. Some of those were capacity driven, and some of them were more coal price and electricity market design driven, issues with passing through coal prices. And then just very recently, this winter, we've been seeing some demand shortages, some energy shortages in parts of the country, mostly attributed to coal supply, but also some higher demand because of the cold winter. There's also some significant issues around seasonal resource adequacy, particularly for hydro-dominant regions. So this is a study that's going to be coming out soon that I've been working on that tracks Yunnan, which is a province in the south, and is actually one of the most marketized provinces of any. But on the coal side, there's a substantial amount of capacity which is considered reserve, which just gets a flat subsidy to be available. It's not a pay-for-performance capacity auction. There's no kind of competition involved here. It's just 2 billion RMB, roughly 300 million US, that's going out to coal plants on an annual basis to deal with the seasonal resource adequacy issues. So hydropower being more available in the wet summer months as opposed to the drier winter months. So these are the type of challenges that China's electricity sector are going to face, managing, squaring these planning and operations problems going forward in order to achieve those very high levels of renewable energy, low carbon deployment that I showed you at the beginning. So if we look a little bit broader about where are some of the frontiers in low carbon technology development in China, China's already a technology leader in solar panels and high efficiency coal plants, in UHV, ultra high voltage transmission lines, electric vehicles and electric buses. These are areas where China is already manufacturing and has technologies to deploy at scale a number of key technologies that are going to be part of a system going forward. China is also making some significant progress on third-gen nuclear. So we saw that the decarbonization pathways imply some significant scale-ups of nuclear over historical levels. China's hoping that some of that's going to be through indigenous designs of third-gen nuclear plants, and also making some progress on longer range EVs and higher capacity batteries, as well as utility scale energy storage. And China's eyeing, among other technologies, CCS and bioenergy with CCS, and negative emissions technology. And if we think about how can we kind of assess or understand what are those technological capabilities and how is China going to actually achieve some of these technological innovations, we can really go to how China has previously done energy innovation programs. And it's really been a combination of two types of programs. One are these top-down R&D programs that you can imagine. There are committees, they're organized by the ministries of science, technology, and a lot of other academics. They're fairly bureaucratic. They involve a lot of coordination among academics and industry folks. This works, but it's inflexible. And there's a couple of examples of this, but China was successful in bringing the technology around high efficiency coal plants to China. But at the same time, it does not work very well if you have changing objectives on your system. So the big issue that coal plants are facing now in China is not that they need to be very high efficiency when they're running at 80–90% loading factor. The big issue right now is they need to be able to run down to 40% or 30% output. That was not part of that original top-down design program, and thus a lot of coal plants in China now need to be retrofitted. And going forward, if how are you going to pay for those costs? How is the market going to incentivize these generators to engage in those more costly retrofits so that they can go to those very low minimum outputs and become flexible in other ways? There's also been a lot of bottom-up manufacturing innovation in China. And this you can think about as local governments. They're supporting smaller firms that have some innovative capabilities. These are not the highest of the high tech, but they're firms that are generating real process innovations that are helping to scale up learning. And so key examples here around solar panels, and then as EVs have become more dominant in China, scaling up some of the manufacturing of new EV technologies. And both of these things are at play now in China's innovation ecosystem as we think about achieving these decarbonization goals. But there have been some changes in recent years. One of them is the increasing use of state-led capital, what you could call patient capital from the state, accompanying with the rise of what some are calling the investor state. So as opposed to directing the funds through state-owned enterprise managers and controlling the production investment decisions, state investment can occur through capital beyond those state-owned enterprises, or maybe through minority shares of state-owned enterprises and some of these private firms that are engaging in these innovative activities. And it's broadly associated with this increased financialization of the state's role in the economy. So again, from a central planning, here's how you produce, to here we're going to manage the flows of the money into the system, who gets what type of money, and thinking about having some kind of more corporate shareholder governance associated with that. One particular vehicle associated with this are called industrial guidance funds. And these are really interesting specialized investment funds. You can think of them as sort of modeled after venture capital, which doesn't really have as significant showing in China as it does in other places. These are capitalized first by SOEs and banks, so through the government. And they have an enormous total funding scope. So just in terms of the guidance funds that have been announced, and their target raise is almost 2 trillion US. And some of the sectors, these are across a lot of sectors. These are by no means dominant in just energy. It's actually semiconductors, chips, a lot of other technologies are targeted through these, but infrastructure, energy, and environment are important components of these IGF sectors, and where we would see potentially a lot of more state-led capital going into more high-risk, innovative firms that could be moving China towards developing capabilities that it needs on the technology front. One last thing to note here is China has enormous amounts of state-owned enterprises that are also going to be engaging in this transition thinking, carbon neutrality thinking. And so carbon neutrality pathways projects have begun already in energy and mining state-owned enterprises, steel and cement state-owned enterprises, petrochemicals, and a lot of other industries. So as a result of China's target broadly to achieve carbon neutrality, a lot of other state-owned enterprises are now being kicked in gear and thinking about what are the technologies and processes they need to have in order to achieve that. So just one example of the kind of immense scope of the transition that we're talking about here, China Energy, which is the largest state-owned enterprise, energy state-owned enterprise in China, has 300,000 employees, and it covers the entire supply chain from coal mining, coal power generation, coal to chemicals, as well as renewables. They have roughly 170 gigawatts of coal capacity and 700 megatons CO2 per year. That's roughly Germany's size of emissions. And they're going to have to come up with a plan of how do you deal with those 300,000 employees that are, for the most part, engaged in fairly carbon-intensive activities. And what do you do with all of that capital that's been spent, the infrastructure that is no longer going to be viable under a carbon neutrality system? And as a result of this, I think we're very likely to see the first commercial CCS BECCS demonstration to occur in the Chinese SOE going forward. And before we wrap up, I just wanted to remind folks that air pollution is the main reason why energy sector reforms have gotten off so far. Climate change is now becoming a really important component of that, but there's a lot of pressing issues beyond climate change which are motivating significant changes in the energy sector, and so we should continue to expect some efforts to deal with these challenges. But of course, we should also be mindful that sometimes policies that reduce air pollution may exacerbate climate change. So there's some co-control that needs to be done around these two policy initiatives. And then bringing us back to the decisions that are going to be kicking off this week with the two meetings in Beijing and the 14th five-year plan. We expect to see, just based on media reports and some draft decisions that have been promulgated, that China's gonna have a much bigger focus on the technology self-sufficiency, climate change, a lot of other components related to that. I think one important component that could come out of this is some more tangible target on coal capacity, because really all of the measures that we're talking about today require China to stop building new coal plants because we already know there's significant overcapacity and dealing with some of the resource adequacy issues in different ways. We're also seeing an increasing number of provinces putting forward their own peaking plans. So China has a national peaking target of 2030 or earlier. We might see additional provinces coming up with peaking years and targets. And I would expect in the 14th Five-Year Plan to have some non-fossil or renewable energy percentage target that would be kind of a stepping stone to achieve the 2030 targets that we laid out, and possibly a capacity target for renewable energy. But we'll see, hopefully by next week, what those pathways are and what are the additional challenges that China's going to face on its road to carbon neutrality. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Terrific. I'm going to moderate the questions, and I would encourage people to post your questions in the Q&A function within the Zoom platform. I'm going to, while I'm waiting for a couple of them to come in, I wanted to tee one up. I saw that the energy analyst Lori Miliverta noted that China's CO2 emissions surged 4% in the second half of 2020 and suggested all eyes are on the 14th Five-Year Plan. And you've already alluded to what we might expect, but I'm wondering to what extent to which China responds to international pressure, or if most of the determinants of China's actions with respect to, say, coal phase down or enhanced plans for moving away from coal are driven by internal dynamics like air pollution and economic considerations at the local level.
Yeah, so I'll just stop share here, and we can go back to the slides if they're useful. I think it's an important question as to what motivating these broader energy sector transitions. I think air pollution has been a big one. I think we've seen a lot more emphasis on renewables deployment and efficiency in coal plants, and also the installation of more pollution controls on coal plants as a result of air pollution, which really became salient around 2010 to 2013. The other question around international pressure is an interesting one. China really made its first large climate commitment at Paris together with the US. So this was a bilateral agreement where both sides agreed to put forward their initial contributions to the Paris Agreement. You'll note that all of the additional Paris commitments that have happened in addition to the peaking target, the carbon neutrality target, were all made unilaterally by China last year. So China is no longer seeing the need to kind of trade off or to cooperate with these large powers in order to make big commitments. I think that indicates to some extent there's already a lot of domestic interest groups and domestic pressure for China to engage not only in air pollution, but also climate change activities going forward. So I think it's right. I think Lori's right that we should be focusing on the 14th Five-Year Plan. That's going to tell us something about how much more capital is going to be put into the ground that's going to become a barrier and a stranded asset when we look towards decarbonizing over the next few decades.
I've got a question here from Sarang Shidore, who's asked about, you mentioned the incredible scale up on an annual basis and over time for renewables. Is land availability a potential constraint for the sorts of renewable capacity that China is targeting by 2050?
It's a really good question. We've had analysis where we looked at where is China going to build out wind deployment, considering land availability as well as grid integration issues. And we find that there's a tension. You want to build some of these wind and solar installations closer to the demand centers, which are mostly east and south, even though they're slightly lower resource quality, because you can avoid some of the grid integration issues, in particular, low utilization of the transmission lines that travel long distances. When you move to those regions, land availability is a key constraint. If you were to continue along the approach that China has taken for the most part with wind and solar up until a few years ago, which is building in the west and the north, more remote regions, but relatively unpopulated regions, then land resource availability is not going to be a key consideration. There, the key consideration is the economics of developing large infrastructure to get it to market.
Terrific. You mentioned a bit ago about you think that commercial CCS will first occur in Chinese state-owned enterprises. What characteristics of those Chinese state-owned enterprises make them more favorable to taking that step?
Yeah, I think the first one is that they don't have to wait around for a tax credit. And that's a pretty big. So we're waiting around in this country to figure out how to make this one particular tax credit work to incentivize CCS demonstration. Now, all state-owned enterprises in China have to come up with a carbon neutrality pathway. And if they have significant coal assets and they don't want to get rid of them, they're going to have to think very carefully about how CCS becomes part of that mix. And they might also want to get really into bioenergy, or you could think of bio-fired coal CCS, so some fraction of bio and coal that makes the carbon work out, plus CCS. So I think the motivations are going to be there. There's some very deep pockets, as I pointed to before, to help incentivize the development of these technologies. I think the key constraints that you'll see in the state-owned enterprise framework is, of course, having innovative capabilities to solve the capture problems on a cost-effective basis, and then also the reservoir. So you have to be very careful about mapping, where is the capture to where is the storage, and all of the accompanying infrastructure that's going to be required. But overall, given the size and scope of SOEs and the challenge that they're now facing with carbon neutrality, I think there's going to be significant pushes to accelerate the CCS R&D, which has already been ongoing in China, to going forward.
Sort of a related question. So if you could have some comments on IGCC, integrated gasification combined cycle in China. Is China mainly retrofitting supercritical plants into ultra supercritical? Is there a possibility of, I think this is CCS from CO2 from thermal power plants, or direct air capture, and hydrogen from electrolysis with carbon credit system? Can you speak to that?
Okay, a lot of technologies there. I'll just pick up a couple. So China did have a pretty prominent IGCC R&D development, over a decade ago. This never really took off. So most coal plants being built in China are ultra supercritical, pulverized coal standard technology, but higher efficiency, higher temperatures. The promise of IGCC is that you could have a more pure stream of CO2 that maybe you could use for other activities, capture, or for other industrial processes. On the efficiency front, the ultra supercritical coal is still going to be generally better. As a result, just because of cost and availability of technology, China's gone mostly pretty big into ultra supercritical pulverized. I don't know if you're going to really see a massive turnaround, because we've already saw China's over 1,000 gigawatts of coal plants. We wouldn't expect to see a whole new rush of new demonstration projects and new technology being built up around coal plants, except perhaps some limited CCS going forward. So I don't know what the exact scope is of IGCC going forward. In terms of the retrofits, the key retrofits here are not moving it from, subcritical to ultra supercritical, which would be prohibitive, but in taking a ultra supercritical plant and adding flexibility improvements and the ability and potentially some other heat rate improvements to make the coal plant more flexible so it can operate at low loads or more ramping, to avoid getting that really big penalty when you move from your supercritical operation, around 80 or 90% loading, as you go down to 40% or 30%, or being able to operate at very low loads without having additional oil fire. So I think that's where those retrofitting is going to be really important going forward for the existing fleet of ultra supercritical plants.
Terrific. You also mentioned some potential activities that could be pursued alongside or air pollution initiatives that could negatively impact climate change efforts. Can you provide some examples of those? I'm thinking probably something like coal to gas that might be good for air quality, but not good for climate change. But are there others?
Yeah, coal to gas would be the first one, but by no means the most important. China was having some very large plans for synthetic natural gas, again, maybe a decade ago, but because of water concerns and secondarily CO2 concerns, those plans have not really been as significant. The bigger issue here is that one easy way of dealing with air pollution in cities is to build a lot of mine mouth coal plants very far away and then connect those with your transmission lines. This, if you're narrowly focused on reducing air pollution in Beijing, then you don't care if you increase emissions in Inner Mongolia next to a coal mine. Now, if you did a population-weighted study, you could probably come to the same conclusion, but nevertheless, there's some pretty significant equity considerations as you relocate that pollution elsewhere. Even if those new plants are efficient, though, let's say they're ultra supercritical, let's say they've got all the new control technologies built into it, you now have significantly more coal capacity on the system that now you have to deal with going forward. That wasn't 30 years old, 40 years old, that you could retire soon in the next decade or so with more and replaced with renewables. Now you have a brand new set of coal plants and a brand new set of transmission lines whose economics is also based on having pretty high loading through those lines. So now, even if you were to take down those coal plants and build a bunch of wind and solar in their stead, because the variability issues, you'd see lower loading in those transmission lines, and the economics just wouldn't work out for the grid companies. The grid company is not too keen on seeing those kinds of large transformations coming. So really, it's coming from this additional lock-in component as you build a lot of potentially new carbon-emitting infrastructure, but that has less of an impact on air pollution.
In one of your slides, you had a footnote that says that China uses a different primary energy accounting method. How does that have a bearing on these issues in terms of, is that just make it hard for external interlocutors to understand what's going on there, or how important do you see that?
It's just important if you want to calculate and compare China's 25% primary energy target with primary energies in other countries. So all other countries, international conventions is to equate terawatt hours with gigajoules, right? Is to convert electricity directly into their energy component. China converts between those two using the average efficiency of the coal fleet. The idea being that the electricity, because electricity and energy have different work components, of course they're not exactly equivalent, fungible. We make them fungible when we're doing these broader primary energy statistics, from the IEA. China doesn't make them fungible, so they have a conversion coefficient. In general, it makes their targets look better than they are. So the 25% primary energy target would actually be less if you used international conventions, but it's just important if you want to compare between the two countries. But in any case, when analysts are doing, at least good analysts, when they're doing these calculations, they'll incorporate that so that they figure out what is the implication of the primary energy target on actual electricity generation.
Helpful. So one thing we haven't talked about is China's plans through the Belt and Road Initiative for overseas plant construction, and does its carbon neutrality target for 2060 have any bearing on what state-owned enterprises are expected to do with respect to their foreign investments, or is this strictly apply to domestic emissions?
Well, narrowly, the commitment that Xi Jinping made last year did not apply to those overseas activities. I think there's a pretty strong logical argument, a policy argument, to say that China should incorporate the activities of its overseas enterprises into its domestic policymaking. And I think that we do see some trends in that regard. Broadly, the challenge here is that a lot of countries want coal, and China, Japan, Korea, and a handful of other countries have been eager and able to provide coal capacity, coal generating technologies for those countries. As there's been more international norms and pressures to push those global financiers away from coal, China's kind of left being the only standing lender in this space, and so is getting a lot of visibility for that. China's indicated in various forums that maybe, for example, the Ministry of environment ecology or others may want to start to crack down on some of these overseas activities. I think it really is a combination, though. We need to fix the politics in China that make exporting coal so profitable. We also need to work with the countries, the host countries where China is building these plants, to help them chart a better domestic energy pathway and to build the institutions that are going to make them very resilient and capable of accommodating high shares of renewable energy.
Another question that we have in the queue is it's a pretty broad, chunky one, but it gets at the extent to which China's emissions are actually the embodied emissions of exports to other countries and satisfying other countries' demand. And so, to what extent is the actual responsibility for emissions of the demand countries as opposed to China itself? And so, if we're thinking about the international responsibility to reduce emissions, how much does that lie with China versus other countries? So how do you think about that question?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you first think about it by looking at the numbers, and there are some studies that have looked at the embodied carbon in China's exports and what does that contribute to overall carbon emissions, and it's not small, right? I think if I'm remembering correctly, I'm thinking around 10%. So that's an important component, thinking about who's benefiting from that. One way that importing countries can approach that problem is thinking about buy clean. There's initiatives like in California and the proposed initiatives in the US to only source from clean produced products if you have some sense of what the carbon intensity was of those imported products. Now, this one is focusing on very carbon intensive products like steel. If you have some sense of what the carbon intensity is of production based on the country of origin, then you could maybe start to make some better decisions. And even maybe in a much more extreme case, you could even implement some kind of border tariffs, which has been proposed in a variety of contexts in more recently to deal with countries that aren't putting in place what others see as being sufficient climate mitigation policies. So I think you could see some combinations of those, start with the numbers and then think about what are the specific policies and goals, and then think about maybe finally what are the incentives in those countries to actually change their production processes to become more clean. If you apply a flat rate to all firms in a country, there's not really an incentive for any more innovative firm in that country to stick out. In fact, it's going to be a race to the bottom in some sense because they're getting hit with the same tariff regardless.
Right. Although the latter might be difficult to deploy in a kind of surgical way. I guess we have time for a couple more questions. One is about EV penetration. What is the expected penetration by, say, 2030, 2050, and how does that figure into sort of your overall electricity capacity projections? Is China likely to reach them? And I think, for our audience, we also might be interested in a sort of second question, but maybe handle it now, is what leverage the U.S. might have in what is the scope for U.S.-China cooperation? We know that was an important feature in the lead up to the Paris Agreement, but we're in a different space in terms of geopolitical interaction. And so, what, if anything, should the Biden administration be doing with respect to China, either on technology cooperation or in terms of a broader strategy that might hasten this decarbonization trajectory, such as it is?
Yeah, two very big questions. So I guess I'll start with the easy one, which is the EVs. So China's already the largest producer deployer of EVs, over 1 million EVs per year. And China's also made some significant commitments to deploy EVs and to phase out ICEs, internal combustion engines. A big component of that is also going to be deploying significant charging infrastructure. And here, the very large grid monopolies have a pretty big role to play. So State Grid has been deploying a number of electric vehicle chargers and also has a significant amount of control apparatus around those to be able to target charging and deal with some of the grid integration issues. So a lot of EVs being deployed, a lot of efforts on the charging side, significant actually private firms in China also pushing the way on EVs, while you're also seeing some other novel approaches like Tesla moving into China, as well as some collaborations with the big automakers in China and foreign automakers. So I think we're going to see a lot of activity in this space. The sector is booming. There's been a lot of local government support for these EVs going forward. China phased out its central policy for EVs or scaled it back, but there's still significant momentum in the market that I think we'd see a lot of EVs being built going forward. But to answer the question around how it's being incorporated, any model that's going to be looking at decarbonization economy-wide is going to have to consider how you electrify transportation. And in particular, if you're not assuming significant amounts of biofuels, which I wouldn't in the case of China, you're going to have to add that load to your electrical demand forecast. So you can look carefully and then consider that in the broader long-term scenario. The bigger question of what the U.S. And China can do on climate, I think this is a really important question. It's a really tough one right now. The relationship is very difficult, very fraught. Climate change is one of those areas where the two countries were able to hammer out this agreement, as I mentioned before. I think those of us who want to see significant climate movement in both countries going forward would love to see some rekindling of that cooperation, and I think there's some promising signs of that. So, arguably the two people most responsible for the creation of that U.S.-China working group and the statement was John Kerry and Xie Zhenhua, the U.S. and Chinese side, and now both of them are back in their respective governments having these roles. So that's a really promising sign. But the overall trade relationship and the broader relationship have changed dramatically since 2014. Brought on by many aspects of the Trump administration, but other broader trends that have been accumulating for some time. So I think it's going to be a challenging path forward to chart some cooperative measures between U.S. and China. It's not going to look like 2014. I think that there is some scope for the two countries to really find areas where they could agree that, hey, we think climate change is a really important national security issue, and we're going to agree to make best efforts to increase deployment, reduce trade barriers, enhance efficient global supply chains, to help our own countries deploy significant amounts of renewable energy, low carbon technology, but also other countries that are dependent on having low cost renewable energy available for them to meet their own carbon goals. So I think there's scope there. I think it's challenging at the moment, but I'm hoping that we'll see some progress because of the people involved.
Well, on some level, the op-ed from the former Chinese ambassador Fu Ying on cooperative competition might be, in the short run, our best case scenario, that there's a race to the top where the US and China are out competing each other to try to be seen as who's decarbonizing the fastest and the deepest. And in part, that's motivated by concern for market share, but also maybe wider diplomatic reputational gains. Any last thoughts for our group? Any final things that you feel like you need to get off your chest before we let you go?
No, I've gotten a lot off my chest already. These are really good questions. My email and my web address was up there, my Twitter. If any folks have any questions afterwards, feel free to get in touch.
Well, on behalf of the University of Texas, I want to thank Dr. Davidson for this terrific intervention. He knows a lot, and I've learned a lot from him, and look forward to your continued work in this space down the road. Thanks again.
Thanks, Josh.